Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Greg Stevens, Director for Professional Development at the American Alliance of Museums, and it's my pleasure to be joined for today's conversation by my colleague and friend, Mike Lesperance, who is the chair of the AAM LGBTQ Alliance, one of our 21 professional networks. Mike, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Greg.
Really glad to have you here to talk about the AAM LGBTQ welcoming guidelines and to give our colleagues who are convened in groups around the country an idea of what to expect in their conversations with their colleagues in their communities. So in this brief conversation that you and I are going to have, we're going to do a quick zip through the welcoming guidelines. We're going to talk about what they mean and how they can be used. And then we're going to give you a few tips on how you can engage in group discussion, small group discussion, and then take action beyond your convening. So let's jump right into it, Mike, and talk about the LGBTQ welcoming guidelines. A quick nod to how they came to be and who made it happen.
Well, Greg, these have been, I think, now 6 years in the making. And they are the product of a group of over 40 people within the museum community on our professional network who came together because we felt that we were tired of talking to ourselves and wanted to create something tangible that members of our community and members of the museum community broadly could consult to make their institutions as welcoming as they could be to the LGBTQ community.
And I want to be clear with everybody here that when we're talking about the LGBTQ community in the context of the welcoming guidelines, what we're really talking about is our visitors, the people who come to our museums, but also our coworkers, our colleagues, the people that we are working with on a day-to-day basis, and how to create a more welcoming environment for those folks as well. The guidelines, as you talked about them, are organized so beautifully. I just love them. Very easy to follow along. The first section is really an alignment with AAM's characteristics of excellence, and those broad categories are public trust and accountability, mission and institutional planning, leadership and organizational structure, collections stewardship, education and interpretation, financial sustainability, and facilities and risk management. And then that's followed up by a nod to the functional areas, whether you're a curator or a registrar or an educator, and then a set of the glossary of terms and terminology that we should and shouldn't be using.
Right.
So let's start at the characteristics of excellence, because I think that's a pretty brilliant strategy that you all have used in making the guidelines happen by aligning them with best practices for the field. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think that, Greg, some of my colleagues who are much smarter than I am decided that a great way to create a framework would be to look at what, as AAM said, are the best practices to being a great museum. And as you know, the characteristics of excellence are what museums look at when they consider getting accredited by AAM and getting a stamp that says that they are the best that they can be in our field.
Right.
By doing that, we immediately did a couple of things that you've alluded to. We are both outward-facing, who are our audiences, who are the communities that our institutions are in, and we are also inward-facing because, of course, AAM's guidelines also deal with issues that relate to staff. And so by aligning those things, it gave us a framework that we could look at and we knew went through all levels of a museum. One of the things that I think is so powerful about the welcoming guidelines is that no matter where you're at in your institution, the guidelines are applicable to you. Unlike many of our groups, this is as broad as could be because LGBTQ issues are everywhere. And by looking at the guidelines, you can immediately identify them and hopefully consider how you can be as welcoming as you can.
Well, the other thing that I love about the way you've structured the guidelines is that it really does depoliticize the issue. So it's not about politics, it's not about emotional reaction, it's not about religion or anything like that. but it really gets down to best practices for the field. So let's take a look at one of the areas, one of the characteristics of excellence. I'm an educator, so of course I'm going to pick the education and interpretation category. And what I love about it is the way you've laid it out. It's a simple checklist where you've got one column that is the LGBTQ recommendations, the guidelines, compared to the characteristics of excellence. So I think it's so useful to be able to take a look at that. Maybe there you go, the education and interpretation. So maybe just give an example of what we're talking about here. Why don't you hold that up for folks so they can see. We've got the standards recommendation here, and then the LGBTQ welcoming guidelines here, and then the checklist, which I think is deceptively simple. Yes, no, or in progress,
right.
Or maybe I don't know. So maybe tell us one thing about the characteristics of excellence for education and interpretation.
Sure, glad to. I think one of the things that I have found in working with the guidelines, the welcoming guidelines, is that so many people are not as familiar with AAM's characteristics as we sometimes might assume they are. And I think that it's a great introduction to those. And again, as you've said, how can we be more welcoming to the LGBTQ community? Let me take an example here. The museum's interpretive content is based on appropriate research. That's a baseline standard. Well, from the perspective of an LGBTQ welcoming guideline, what does that mean? Well, that means that the museum includes LGBTQ voices in its advisory councils, committees, or other means to include the community in the development of educational and interpretive materials and experiences. It also talks about research subjects and donors of collections and how to handle that if sometimes someone makes an anonymous donation, for example. And it also looks at how to develop inclusive content and experiences through an open, transparent, and clearly articulated policy. And so you're touching on several things, and each of the guidelines is like that. And if you consider that there are these 7 areas with 38 characteristics, and we go through each of them, and then, as you said, we flip it around and filter it through different functions in the museum and do the same thing, really no matter where you're coming from. And I think this is one of the key points for everybody sitting in the room today. No matter where you're coming from, you can find a relevant connection to this document. And I think that's our goal.
Right, I love that. I love this functional area. So you were kind of drilling down from 30,000 foot to 15,000 foot. So maybe pick out the public engagement functional area of the guidelines, because it's laid out in a similar way,
Yes.
where we're looking at the characteristics of excellence through the lens of your functional role in public engagement. And that might be education, it might be visitor services, it might be some other kind of interpretation role, visitor experience manager, for example. So maybe share one of the correlations in this category.
Absolutely. And this one may seem obvious, but again, empowering yourself with something in a document like this really helps make the point. The museum identifies the communities it serves and makes appropriate decisions in how it serves them. That's the baseline characteristic that we're talking about. Well, how does that relate to an LGBTQ welcoming component? The museum has identified LGBTQ communities as an audience to serve. The museum includes LGBTQ voices in its advisory councils, committees, or other forums. It seems very basic, but that's something that you can go in and you can look at this and say, are we doing this? How can we be doing this? And I think that this is something that is a real springboard, not just for LGBTQ audiences, but broadly. You can take out LGBTQ and insert many other communities in here, and whether that's focused on religion, race, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic level, and really get at who are we serving? Who is our community? I
think what we want to do now is really turn our attention to our colleagues convened in groups around the country and give them a few tips on how they can have these conversations. So the first thing we want them to be able to do is to, of course, have read the guidelines and to be somewhat familiar with them so that they can open a conversation in a transparent, honest way in the larger group, getting some reaction to the welcoming guidelines as a tool, as a guideline, as a toolkit, if you will. And then we want people to be able to have smaller, more focused conversations. So maybe you can talk about that just briefly.
Yeah, I think our goal is that after you're done listening to us drone on, to be able to have, as you say, a few minutes of discussion. And I think that to reiterate that these discussions are taking place in a safe environment where you should feel free to share your concerns, your fears, what you see as successes that you have had or you're aware of, and also obstacles, things that you're concerned about at your institution or specific to your function in the museum. And after that brief discussion, we invite people to assemble in groups of perhaps 4 to 6 and take about 20 minutes to go through and pick out some of these areas that really pertain to your function in the museum and consider things like what is your museum doing with regard to the practices that we highlight. What could it be doing? What do you see as potential obstacles to some of these welcoming guidelines? And I think one of the things that is worth asking yourself is also, what are the consequences of not following some of these welcoming practices? What would that mean for the institution today and moving forward?
What we hope happens out of the groups that you're in is that you have note takers, whether it's somebody writing down on a notepad or flip charts and sticky notes, some way of capturing this information around some of the key questions that you see in your toolkit. And ultimately, we'll get all of that information back to AAM and compile it so that it can be a new resource, not only a resource broadly, but also perhaps as a way of informing future iterations of the LGBTQ welcoming guidelines.
Absolutely.
So we're really glad that you are convened with us and using this as a springboard for taking action. And I am thrilled to have this opportunity to chat with you, Mike. So thanks so much for being here. It's always a treat. And we look forward to hearing back from your convenings. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.